Hello, everyone. In this Zoom session, we'll be discussing primate beginnings. So let's do a screen share of the first lecture in the trilogy in primate evolution in this section. Okay, so primate beginnings. First thing to understand is, what is a primate? When you're seeing one in the world, what do all primates possess in characteristics? Now, the chart that we're looking at here is what primates now and primates by about 53 to 54 million years ago all had in common. We will begin later in the slide. We'll start with, the transitional primates, who were the actual first primates, and what accumulating characteristics that they were gaining to become a true primate. So how do we recognize one? There are 9 basic categories here, and there are a few other specialty points, but these are the main ones that I want you to know. Okay, first, that the big toe and the thumb are opposable on almost all primates. You see the posability back and forth. Now, we are also primates, humans, and only we have an opposable thumb. We've lost our opposable toe, beginning with hominin evolution just around 6 million years ago. That sideways, opposable thumb began to become inline and adapted for the walking. But in general, we stem from ancestors that had both opposabilities of thumbs and of toes. Now, the hands are also prehensile. Now, prehensile is a kind of a woolly term. So prehensile means, a lot of dexterity, a lot of range of movement. It also means fine control. So notice what we can do with our hands is sort of fine control movement, which you don't see on other, mammals, obviously. Like if you have a dog and you came home and your dog was doing this to you, hello, where have you been? Oh, I'm hungry. We think there's something wrong with that, like back pain, right? But only this fine control, and it's not just the length of the fingers. It's also very fine muscular connections to the tendons, which we have embedded with nerve endings that allow this sort of movement. And all primates share this. In addition, prehensile can also mean the wide dynamic range that it has. That means pure raw strength as well as fine control. And we do have a lot of strength in our hands. I have done an experiment myself, picking up like a bathroom scale, the spring-loaded ones, and squeezing down, and I can instantaneously squeeze my own body weight, or even higher than double my body weight, which I cannot, weight lift. I can't possibly do that, which shows you the dynamic range of something like this, which we don't see anywhere else in the mammalian, entire mammalian scheme of animals out there. All 4,000 don't possess this sort of abilities. All right, next, the nails. We all have nails. We have flat nails and set of claws, and this is across the board on all primates that exist today. Now, some of the lower orders of primates we're looking at have, in addition, they have a nail, what we call their dew claw, which is the number 2nd digit. So this is the digit order. The thumb is the first, index the second, have a nice day, fingers the third, the ring finger is number 4, and the pinky is number 5. So on digit number 2, in addition to the nail, on lower order primates, which we'll look at, lemurs and lorises, we do see an extension that is a primitive sort of claw. We call it toilet claw or dew claw. But those are the only exceptions, but still everything has nails. In addition to nails, fingerprints. So we look at the pads at the bottom of all primates. We have raised, little ridges in which are called fingerprints. Of course, we use those for, our ID now because we're always about criminal behavior. We have to think about what the function of these are for. Well, first, we have to think about in tandem with what's going on with the flat nail. The flat nail is designed to spread the pads of the fingers apart to increase the surface area for contact and as well for sensing. So the raised areas of the fingertips are loaded with nerve endings so that primates can sense what they're touching, and think about this, primates are basically arboreal creatures. For the most part, that's our ancestors, for our heritage. And when they're grasping things like branches, you want to try to understand, what sort of texture do you have? Is the bark going to give away? Can I hold on to this? As well as when you're sensing for food products, you want to know the texture of something, the feel of something. Even in fruits, we can tell different things about fruits and the foods that we're touching by that sort of sensory apparatus that is provided by the nail spreading the broad into the fingers, exposing all those nerve ends on the end of the fingertips, right? With the finger, the fingerprints. All right. Next, primates are hind limb dominated. The strength usually comes from our hind limbs, as well as the balance of our bodies. The balance of our bodies sits in the lower trunk. And this is the heavier end, and that's across all primates. Of course, there's variations in the ratios back and forth, but in general, we're going to see hindlimb domination. And a lot of this has to do with propulsion. Most primates move by moving their lower parts of their body, including monkeys. They move across the tree tops by vertically leaping. The rare exception will be the apes who do vibration, but still, even in the brachiating apes, we see a lot of hind limb domination. Right? Number 4, unspecialized olfactory smelling. That means your sense of smell as a primate is really not that good compared to other mammals. Right. So, a typical dog that you might have in your household, a typical dog will smell at least 1,000 times better. And many, like bloodhounds can be up to a million, right? Even 100 million times better within certain compounds. So our sense of smell isn't very good, very, very reduced. And particularly this occurs in diurnal primates. And diurnal, I mean primates in which sleep at night and are awake in the day, like humans, which I think we're violating those rules during COVID time because most of my neighbors are up all night, which they shouldn't be, because they'll have the dire health consequences. But for diurnal primates especially. Now, even the nocturnal primates, which is those which are awake in the night, while their sense of smelling is much better than the diurnal, the nocturnals generally aren't as good as other mammals in general. So we can say this, there is relatively a less reliance on smell in primates. Now, controversially, the contrary end of this, where do we get our great jump at? What senses are good in primates? It's visual, our visual senses. Our visual acuity is very, very good. Other forms of life like fish too, such as birds of prey, but ours is very special in that we have overlapping stereoscopic vision. High acuity, our eyes are facing forward, our visual fields overlap. And by overlapping the visual field, we get a very good sense of depth perception, how far things are away from us. Right? And in addition to that, in many orders of families of primates, there is color vision, high acuity color vision. So between, the resolution that we can provide, the overlapping field, the stereoscopic vision provides us to get depth perception and color vision. Primates have very highly developed overall, visual senses. Next, number 6, you're looking at the chart here. Females have small litters, so we can refer to our progeny as litters. Of course, the colloquial term we use are families. It sounds better that way. It somehow differentiates ourselves from other animals, but it's not true. We have small litters, and by small I mean just one at a time generally. Twins among humans and other primates are relatively rare. The only exception that I know is among the emperor tamarin of South America. It regularly gives birth to twins, but other than that, one at a time, because it takes so long for primates to grow up. And essentially this, we have bigger brains. And for the most part, most of what we know, and this includes all forms of primates, comes from the way that we're taught. Most of the behavior that we have is learned behavior. I mean, there's various degrees and perspectives, with humans be the highest learners with the lowest amount of instinct. But overall, when you compare all the primates to other mammals, we have, as a group, less instinctual elements to our behavior than learned behavior. Thus, it takes a little while to get, a juvenile, on its feet, properly. So you need to dedicate the time to that individual, versus having a whole large amount of litters, which would risk the species if you did it otherwise. Okay. Next, brain size. Yes, I mentioned that in 6. So point number 7 really follows. Point number 6 falls into point number 7. We have relatively large brains. All primates do, and of course, humans, being the upper end of encephalization. So encephalization just means the size of the brain. And when we refer to the size of the brain, mass-wise to the size of the body, we call that the encephalization quotient, the EQ quotient. You may see that in the literature. But just remember, in general, all primates have relatively large brains for their body size compared to all the other mammals, which are that. And of course, all the other mammals have larger brains than all the other orders of animals which are out there. Right? So we're in that upper end of the spectrum. All primates, and all primates are particularly smart. If you've ever been around primates at any period for any period of time, you would notice this. Right? Next, this has to do with the dentition of the teeth. In general, when we look at primates, in general, there are a few exceptions. The molars that we see, the teeth in the back, are relatively unspecialized. Ours are like the Swiss Army knives, like I said, molars. In other words, there's round cusps. There's 5 round cusps in humans, at least. 3 on the outside, 2 on the inside. And these are for mashing, just mashing food, grinding and mashing food into smaller pieces, pre-digesting our food. But we also have on the outside sort of raised areas of our molars. These raised areas can be used for shearing, cutting and stripping. So there's a broad variety of things which can be achieved by our molars, right? Which emphasizes that primates in general have a relatively generalized diet. A broad perspective of foods that most primates can eat. And when you consider humans, what is it that we can't eat, besides wood and maybe some cellulose products and grasses? Other than that, the world is open and is ours. Okay. What else is about the mouth? Well, we have to first think about the number of teeth we have in our mouth and patterns. It's very unique among primates, and there's some limitations that exist in primates versus other mammals. Okay, first of all, we have to learn how to divide our mouth up into measurable quadrants. So we have to divide our mouth first into upper and lower, and then on the quadrants on each side, left and right. And these make 4 quadrants of the mouth. Now, paying attention to just one quadrant at a time, what sort of tooth patterns do we see? All right. In primates, a maximum of two incisors, right? Per quadrant, 2 incisors. So you're 2, 1, 2, maximum of 2. 1 canine, only 1 canine, and a maximum of 3 premolars. Now, humans and apes have 2 premolars. Many of the other primates have 3 premolars, but a maximum of 3 premolars, and that's it. Now, point number 9. This is a very cranially specific sort of stuff here. Post-orbital bar is important. This is an important one, and you can touch it right here. So you can feel it around the ring around your eye, that bony ring around your eye here. That's it. There's your post-orbital bar. And not many forms of mammals have these things. Now, horses and lemurs, have post-orbital bars. But our post-orbital bar is formed for a different reason than we think things like horses have formed. In many, in the horsehead line, we find out the post-orbital bar is really to strengthen the skull because of chewing and mashing. Now, in primates, it might be for that reason too, but in addition, it's for protection. Protection from living in an arboreal environment where slips and falls could jeopardize your most valuable sensory apparatus, which is the eyes. So this ring of bone on the outside is common to all primates and is considered something that is very protectionary towards the eye itself. Right. Next, this thing called a petrosal bulla. In a laboratory course, we might look at something like this. This is nothing, it's not a big deal for us, but it's a very kind of a ring-like structure, a bone. So you have an inner ear canal that moves into your ear, and that canal in there, in many species, is a little bit more flexible than something in a primate. Primates have a ring-like bony enclosure, a bony plate that encloses that, which creates something rigid and protective. Thus we're hearing all the time. So during contortions and stuff, the ear canal won't tend to collapse as much, and it's also protected from a lot of impacts. And that's something very unique to primates, this petrosal bulla. But the petrosal bulla is very, very small, and it would be very difficult for me to show you without being in the laboratory situation to magnify it up. So we're not going to worry too much about that. All right. So I put a couple of definitions here for you to look at: the petrosal bulla, as well as the post-orbital bar. Now, I think about all these traits in which we're looking at, right? All these traits we're looking at were established, roughly just about 54 to 55 million years ago. Right about that point of time, everything comes together to create what we call the first true primates. Now, before we get to what we call the first true primates that have all these characteristics, let's see, how earlier forms of primates, proto-primates, began to accumulate these things, when these occurred, and what they look like. Okay. So the earliest primate ancestor is believed to be a genus which we call Purgatorius. Purgatorius has a few species that were members of it, but they're all very similar. And we can call these things, proto-primates. These are things that are an early transition towards primates. Now, we've seen this before, in unrelated, events in history, or actually related events in history, but in deep history. We saw that with the genes called Tiktaalik. And we viewed that in the very first film of Your Inner Fish. We're looking at, the adventures of Neil Shubin as he went into Greenland to find his transitory fish. And he discovered that the freshwater fish, were making a transition to land beginning at just about 375 million years ago. And Tiktaalik, of course, did not have all the characteristics of a fish, nor did it have all the characteristics, of a land animal, these tetrapods that really began the journey for terrestrial animals. What it did have, it had the bulwark of its body was mostly fish. What it was accumulating are a few adaptations, such as the movement of the transition of the upper fins to become limb-like, right? Both fin and limb-like to allow it to move on shore. So the very first primates that we see should have, a bolus amount of terrestrial adaptations and a few nascent early adaptations for life within the trees. Now, Purgatorius shows these few adaptations we're going to look at beginning just about 66 million years ago. And this thing was a small little rat size, insectivore. And we can tell that by its teeth structure, which we'll look at, eating insects. And it burrowed in small holes in the ground, right? So it was living in the ground. And it was an insectivore, most likely eating insectivores in every environment which you could find, including into the trees. Now, the trees at this period of time, and this is a picture of Purgatorius here, the trees at this period of time were flowering plants. Many of them were flowering plants. The new flowering plant will be called angiosperms, were evolving at this time. Previous to 150 million years ago, the world never saw a flowering plant. All the plants were different sort of varieties, such as gymnosperms, which did not have flowers, only brown and green colors. Now, by the time Purgatorius is coming along, we're seeing, fruiting trees, small fruits with flowers. And then these flowers are, of course, attracting insects. The insects feeding on the nectars, and of course, doing the job for the trees by pollinating, moving reproductive capacity of the trees around. So this small rat-like, insectivore living in the ground is moving up towards the trees, increasing the breadth of its niche range. So what parts of this thing are, primate-like? Well, really, relatively few things, but because they come in tandem, we can tell this is a pretty good candidate for the very first stem, the very first primate ancestor. Well, first of all, it has elongated digits. Digits, of course, the fingers and on the hands on both, right? So the digits are a little bit longer. When we talk about length, we're talking about relative proportion to the overall length of the foot. The digits are a little bit proportionally larger to anything else we've seen really within mammals. They're very tree shrew-like to a good degree. We're giving a little indication they're tree shrew-like. So what makes it different than a tree shrew? Well, a couple of things in many respects. The ankle bones. The ankle bones are unique in the way that they're flexing. They allow for the foot to move more up and more down and a little bit up inside, back to camber, cast camber back and forth a little bit. Then we see, in a typical thing like a shrew or any sort of ground-dwelling mammal at this period of time. And what's significant about this is that one of the rules of nature is the more flexible the joint, the less power it's able to produce. So the trade-off for early Purgatorius here, for moving into the trees, a little more flexibility of getting into the branches, was that he was slower on the ground. And that would have been a negative thing because he would have been more vulnerable to predation. But the overall impact was more productive, more positive for this creature to be in the trees, feeding from the rich fruits, but the insects, insectivorous diet he was on, than what he would have lost during predation on the ground. So when we see something like this, it's a pretty good indication, that this is one of the very first primate ancestors. Not only that, the form that appears right after Purgatorius, an evolutionary sequence, shares something very important. Not only the adaptation for elongated fingers, not only the adaptations in the ankle, but also the incisors. The morphologies of the incisors are almost identical in certain ways, which links this as an apical ancestor, right, to what we're going to actually see down line. And that's a very important thing to see the trilogy together, right? So there's grandma, potentially grandma, say my grandma, there's an ancestral line, how beautiful you are. Now, of course, when we're looking at this as an artistic rendition of this, and the fossil record, of course, all we have are the bone fragments and teeth, and we've had to rebuild it to this sort of level. Is it guaranteed 100% accuracy? Absolutely not. And do we know about the coloring of this particular form, Purgatorius? Absolutely not. This is just a best guess. Right. So next, now we're talking about the very, very first primates. Sorry about that. When you talk about, overall, what are primates are out there today, in relationship from the very beginning to the very end. Now we'll fill in what happened during the middle, but now we know what's at the very beginning. Let's look at the sort of diversity that we have at the end run, which is today in our evolutionary history. And how can we group these things together, right? So big groups. So we have our early primate ancestor down there, Purgatorius, down at about 66 million years ago. And then we have all these living forms which are at day zero, which is today. Right? So what happens? Well, first in the evolutionary sequence, we end up getting these splits, phylogenetic splits between groups. And the first group sort of split off in the sequence were the group which consists of lorises, bush babies, and lemurs. Now we refer to this group together as prosimian. These prosimians. Now there are other scientific names for these groups, which we'll look at a little bit later. Prosimians tends to be more of an antiquated term, but it's still used quite a bit within the literature, so we need to become a little bit familiar with it. And there's good reasons to use prosimian. Now, simian means monkey, right? Monkey, monkey-like, monkeyoid. And pro means beginning, pre to that. So there's something previous to that, some adaptations in which these things do not have, that groups like monkeys and higher animals do have. And we'll be looking at those things, and we're making some sense of it. We won't talk about that till we get to where living orders of primates. All right, now next in the evolutionary sequence are these things called tarsiers. So tarsiers sort of split up on their own. There's only one group of tarsiers in the world right now, and that's it. They're very unusual in their characteristics. And a lot of times there's a mosaic of characteristics between the earlier sort of prosimians and the later group, which we call the Anthropoids. There's a lot of mosaics going on, and a lot of unique things that tarsiers have, which make them sort of an enigma and sort of a woolly thing to sort of classify. But for right now, we're going to put them in their own category of just tarsiers. Now, later on, what we see is the evolution of the higher level primates. And by a higher level, I really mean social complexity and actually ability to think. I mean, these are smarter, bigger and smarter primates. And they're given a big classificatory term called anthropoids. And that includes, all the monkeys, all the way up to humans. And we can see in this diagram, it includes New World monkeys, Old World monkeys, gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees. Also, bonobos should be in there too, but they're closely related, and the glorious human, us. Now, if you notice some of the terms I use here, especially in the monkey groups, like they're sort of like colonial terms, and they are New World. New World's a colonial term. Well, by New World, it gives us some geographical reference, but we need to sort of condense that down a little bit. By New World, we mean something up into the region up into southern Mexico, around Veracruz, around the Yucatan Peninsula, ranging all the way down to southern Brazil. Right? That would be the range in which we find New World monkeys, and that's it. Now, older monkeys, and again, another colonial term, refers to the old world, but we have to limit the old world to particular regions. It's very important. Old world would mean Africa, parts of the Middle East, Indonesia, and as well as some areas of Japan. So as we leave the monkey world, we're getting into the ape world, the world of what we call the hominoids. And these share, a blanket of suites of characteristics together, which we'll talk about. But we need to figure out these hominoids, how can we further break them down into categories that make sense to us? Well, first, we can see the gibbons. The gibbons split off after the old world monkeys, right, into their own line. And gibbons are considered lesser apes. So when we think about gibbons, they're lesser apes. And the orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, or humans, we're all greater apes. We're all the great apes. I'm a great ape. I love that. So 4 categories of great apes, 1 category of lesser apes. Okay. Now, the greater apes, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans, are grouped together because we have greater behavioral complexity, greater social complexity, and greater levels of intelligence. And we tend to be even more, terrestrial, of our origins. Orangutans, while they spend a lot of time, in the trees and the canopy, they are relatively on the ground more than you're going to find something like a gibbon. Gibbons are almost purely, arboreal. So there's this tendency in evolutionary time towards, a shift, in more, transitory behavior between the boreal canopy as well as the ground. And that takes, again, a lot more behavioral complexity. And of course, ours we're more ground oriented than arboreal by far at this point. Okay. So now we sort of get a rough outline of what's out there now. Now we need to put some dates on when things are happening and put some motion into this. So let's explore this by looking at our first continuation into our primate ancestor. We've got Purgatorius down to see what is next. Okay. So the next group that comes along is a pretty large group, and they're around for a long period of time, roughly, 9 million years, and they do the bulwark of change for primates, leading towards all those adaptations which we see. We know Purgatorius is starting to give us a little elongated fingers, right? A little elongated fingers. Some change in the ankle bones for flexibility. And we just see some relatedness to this next group called Placeidae performance with the shape of the canine. but it's Adepoids that do the rest. Okay? So they began just about 65 million years ago. So we see that 66 million year point with Purgatorius, next by the Adepoids. And again, they're not just one species. This is a group of allied, close, a genus is allied with a lot of different species. And they're going to be doing their transition up into about 54 to 55 million years ago. A group, a section of these Adepoids are going to do a phylogenetic split, and they're going to move towards more common primates, which we see today. While that happens, the Adepoids are still going to be around. I mean, they're still out there as they split off into groups of primates. So we're doing a split. And eventually the primates become so much better, at existing in the environment, the arboreal environment above us, that they put the Adepoids, out of business into extinction, which often happens with phylogenetic splits. Now, we are a perfect example of that. We split from a subspecies of humans called Neanderthalensis, Homo neanderthalensis, roughly 400,000 years ago. And that split led to the demise of one of the subspecies. And of course, we're the reigning kings of the planet now, placing most likely we did place the Homo neanderthalensis to extinction. Well, this is the pattern that we see in nature all the time. So when we see that range from 65 to 37, it doesn't mean that our transition to primates took place 37 million years ago. It took place relatively earlier, roughly about 9 million years after primate evolution actually began. Okay, so let's have a look at these Adepoids. Now, Adepoids as a group were slightly different than Purgatorius. Now, they began very Purgatorius-like, and over the 9 million transitional year period, we start accumulating more and more primate traits. Okay, but in general, if we could take a mid-range, like right in the middle, what did we see like 62 million years ago on average? Maybe something like this. They still have relatively small brains. They're very mammalian-like brains. We don't see anything, a big movement towards primate categorization on that end. The faces are also what we call prognathic. So when we think about prognathicism, that's facial jutting. So they have long faces. So still much like, traditional dogs or horses, and their actual ratio of their face to the rest of their bodies. Okay? They also have pretty good diastemas. And diastemas are gaps between teeth, and particularly the gap between the canines and the premolars, right? So in horses, you put like two fingers in there, but you can still have relatively large canines at any mammal that you're looking at, and you would see that gap in Adepoids too. So again, these are very primitive mammalian traits. Well, the next thing that we have to look for that's a true primate sort of characteristic is a postorbital bar. At large, when we look at the skull of Adepoids, we do not see a postorbital bar. In some ways, we can see a thickening, some sort of curvature that's happening or thickening of the bone in some areas in the skull, which indicates maybe a pre-postorbital bar. That's open to a lot of arguments. That's why I put a question mark there. Does it have a pre-postorbital bar or not? We're still trying to tease that one out. In the later Adepoids, they're moving towards primate. Yes, we can start seeing something change as a split to actual true primate groups actually occur. But in the middle ground, we're not quite sure, right? Yes, we won't utilize that as a solid characteristic. Elongation of digits, definitely yes. That's one of the things we see, even further elongation of the digits than something like Purgatorius had. The ankle bone structure is even becoming progressively more flexible, which is a really good sign coming in our direction towards the primates. And for the first time, we're starting to see some movements of the eyes forward. This is something that Purgatorius didn't have. Purgatorius really in the skull was still very much, like a traditional sort of ancestral mammal. The only thing that we could see some, canine characteristics were very similar to the Adepoids. But Adepoids are definitely starting to change the eye structure. And they're not fully facing forward eyes with stereoscopic vision yet, but we're making some movements, relative to what we see in, the traditional, ancestral mammalian stock. So why is all this occurring? Well, of course, for life in the trees. The first primates and still primates today in general are arboreal. They live in the trees. But for what purpose? For visual predation. The first ancestors that we had, Purgatorius and both Adepoids, were insectivores. And we'll talk about dietary characteristics in a moment, what this actually means, but insectivores, eating insects. So they're up there near the flowers, watching, getting close, utilizing the fingers to move across the branches towards the end branch niche, further and further out to support their weight, all four limbs at a time, getting out close and watching the insects get around the flowers and grabbing, pinpoint accuracy, where you're getting good depth perception. So you have a higher catch ratio, right? So you're feeding yourself, visual predation model. And that one tends to hold up very, very well. And what we see not only in the fossil record, but we see in current day primates who some of them actually have this sort of life. All right, so next. Let's look at Placididae performance of the skull. And we can look at what we're talking about. We say, mix of sort of traits here. And it's still, Placididae performance, we're still, again, if we're looking at, does it have more true primate characteristics or more true, mammalian characteristic, ancestral sort of stuff? But still, it's towards the ancestral side. We're just starting to gain primate characteristics. So this is probably where we're at with Tiktaalik. This is our Tiktaalik, of primates right here. We still have that narrow snout that's a little bit long. The eyes are starting, you can see the curve where the cheekbone here starting to move a little bit more forward. It's not as quite as swept back. So a little bit of movement of the eyes going forward. We don't see a postorbital bar, but when we look, at the way the bone sort of flares up, it's a pretty sharp flare up, particularly in the front part here. A little flare up around where the connection would begin to grow. Maybe pre-postorbital. We're not quite sure yet. We're not quite sure. Okay, still small brains like traditional mammals, right? Very small brains, right? Spiky teeth. Now, the thing about the spiky teeth, they do tell us something about its insectivorous sort of lifestyle. It tells us right off the bat what they're doing. Now, there are very few mammals now, very few primates now that have purely spiky teeth like this. So, this still sort of lends toward a sort of an evolutionary past. This is where we're really tied to that primitive mammals. And of course, the hallmark, one of the hallmarks of being a primate is having, nails and not claws. In both Placididae performance, we still see claws. While some people argue that the back end, the posterior end of the claw, the back, like the back side of your nail where it contacts thing, is a little bit broad, it's a little bit broader, which means there might be some sort of, the end of the finger here beginning to broaden, the pads are beginning to get a little bit larger around the claw. The claw is still looping. There's a little bit more fleshy area that's in contact here, a little bit. Nothing to say that this thing's functioning as a nail yet, but it looks like we're getting some sort of transition from the nail to the claw, all right, to the claw. So we have our transitional creature right here. All right. Let's move on to the next slide. So let's talk about dietary classification. All right, so we talked about our first primates, the very first proto-primates, Purgatorius, including Placididae, as being insectivorous, eating insects. Well, what are the dietary classifications are there, which we're going to be discussing in this course? So we need to know some of these terms here, right? So in general, when we just talk about plants, eating plants, we talk about something being herbivorous. Well, you know what? That's not enough generally, especially among primates, because we had to figure out what we mean by herbivorous, which parts of the plant are particular primates eating, right? Well, if they're eating leaves, they're folivorous or folivores, okay? If they're eating fruits, they're frugivorous, they're frugivores. If they're eating grasses, they're graminivorous, they're gramnivores. And today we only have one living primate that's actually, a gramnivore eating grasses. It's very, very rare among primates, by the way. We almost eliminate that category. I don't want to, because gelada monkeys are important in a group their own, but they're a small proportion. So much of the primates out there nowadays are folivores and frugivores, eating either leaves or fruits. Okay, we have a few primates that are gummivorous. Gumivores, so they're eating gums and sap. Some of the lower order primates can do. They could actually scrape. They have special dentition we'll look at to scrape gums and saps off trees if they need to as fallback sort of foods. But they're a very limited group too. But they're still more populated than something like the gramivores, the ones that eat the grasses. Now we can talk about sort of overall generalized terms. So like carnivore, the word carnivore, which we toss around a lot too. The thing about it is like, so we had a carnivore, but what if the primate we're looking at just eats insects? Would that be a carnivore? That's why carnivore is a weird term. A lot of times we use carnivores eating all sorts of meats, and it's just not specific enough. So when we talk about, primates, we need to be more specific than that. So carnivore is not something that I'm going to throw around very much. Okay, because think about carnivores out there in the world. So we can say, yes, lions are carnivore, but think about the type of foods in which they eat. They don't eat all the different types of meats. So when we're talking about this in biological terms, it's not specific enough. The same thing with omnivorous. The idea of eating everything. What do we mean by everything? There's different sorts of omnivory in the world, different sorts of combinations out there, which are very important. They tell us about very specific adaptations in the creatures in which we're looking at. So carnivorous, omnivorous are terms in which we'll probably not be utilizing very much within this course, and we'll be sticking to the dietary classifications of that. All right. Now let's begin talking about real primates. When we get all those classifications together, when did this happen, and why do we refer to these primates as? Well, we refer to true primates when we start getting all the classifications, all those ingredients together as euprimates, you meaning true and primates, of course, being primates, so true primates. Now, of course, you and I are true primates, and I don't refer to you and I as euprimates because euprimates is really more of a historical term. So when we say euprimate, our heads should drift back to just about 55 million years ago when all this begins to really come together. Now, when it becomes together, what happens is this sort of stalk that splits off the Placidia Apiforms quickly split off into two sort of groups themselves. And we start to diversify. We're looking at a radiation of primates. They're going to be adapted slightly different for different, sort of food resources and different sort of climates. Well, the first sort of rough adaptations that we see are in two groups, and which are called the Adepoids and the Mymonoids, the Adepoids and Mymonoids. Right, so we can just call these Adepoids and Mymonoids. We don't have to worry too much about the harsh Latin terms. So Adepoids and Mymonoids are what we're going to use. So we see these things starting at just about 55 million years ago. Both groups have all the characteristics of primates that we've got so far, so which we need. So we've been a complete transition to begin to split. Now, Adepoids, which we can see from the evidence that we have, are mainly diurnal. They're awake during the daytime, feeding in the day, sleeping at night. They're herbivorous, and herbivorous, of course, is a term that we need to sort of, clamp down on, and we will. We'll talk about that in the next slide, particularly what they're eating. But let's compare these things to Mymonoids. Mymonoids, these are mainly nocturnal, so they're feeding in the night, and they're insectivorous. Now, more specifically, they're frugivorous, eating insects and fruits. And they're relatively small, right? Now, Adepoids, on the other hand, actually are relatively much larger than we're going to be getting. So we have a little bit larger Adepoids, a little bit smaller Mymonoids. So here are my Mymonoids right here. Now, this is a representative sort of genus, Shoshonius, that appeared during the Eocene. I just picked one out. Lots of different genus, and they all have common characteristics together. Mymonoids, they have larger eye orbits, or bigger eyes, okay? And compared to Adepoids, which have smaller eyes. Of course, the larger eyes would be designed to collect more light, so we believe these things were nocturnal. And they also have much reduced facial jutting, right? The prognathism is much more reduced. Now, look, that's what we're talking about a primate when we're getting a reduction in prognathism. Now, they're specifically adapted more for insectivorous and frugivorous lives, insects and fruits. That's their niche. Nighttime, feeding, insects, and fruits. We have one niche. Okay. Now, this is very much like what we're going to see in tarsiers. Tarsiers today, do the same thing. They have large eye orbits. They're primarily insectivorous, and they have some frugivory, some fruit within the diet. So very tarsier-like. That gives us some indication about who they're ancestral to. Now, the next are these things which we call Adepoids. So Adepoids are, again, a closely related group with some, morphological differences. So their bodies are a little bit larger, and by large at that time, 18 ounces. I mean, primates are still small, and they might have been 30 to 40% larger than we think of the Mymonoids. So the thing about it is larger bodies usually means they're consuming foods that take a little bit longer to ruminate and break down, which means they're probably fulvivores, feeding on leaves up in the canopy. And that's very important because it's an entire, biochemistry is different, the digestive tract differences than the Mymonoids, which might tell us about, who these groups are actually linked to, in the modern day world. Because, the larger you get, and if you're eating fulvivores, your metabolic rate has to slow down. So it makes them, more common to what we can see in what we call the lemurs, lorises, and bush baby group, which we're looking at the ancestral sort of ends of that. And of course, they have smaller eyes, which indicated they probably could be much more diurnal. All right. Now, again, there's a skull on the bottom. You compare this skull to what we see, above, with the genus with the genus Shoshone. So look at that. So look at how much shorter, the less the prognathicism is in these Mymonoid groups, and how much longer the prognathicism in the Adepoid groups. Now, the interesting thing about that is that we can look at prosimians. They never mentioned the lemurs, lorises, and bush babies. They tend to have more prognathicism than do the higher level primates, such as the tarsiers, and the anthropoid groups, which have less prognathicism, which gives us a hint about we're ancestral too. And this is what we think. Now, while there is some argument going on here about descent, who were these original sort of primate groups, so the first few primates, who did they give rise to? Now, I'm going to add some terms here, so we pay attention. So these primitive Adepoid group with the longer snouts, right? These are the ones that tend to be diurnal, probably feeding on leaves. There's a lot more leaf eaters out there. They're probably the ancestors of a group which we know as Strepsirrhini. Now, Strepsirrhini is a broad group, another broad characteristic group that includes lemurs, lorises, bush babies. Okay, so Adepoids just make a transition to Strepsirrhini and just sort of fulfill more specific sort of group identity, right? More solidified stuff that separates them even further than the Mymonoids. So Strepsirrhini is just a condensed Adepoid, more solid characteristics, which are different than the Adepoids. And the Strepsirrhines are going to be ancestral to the bush babies. Now, the Mymonoids, it seems like that they're ancestral to tarsiers and all the anthropoids. And anthropoids, of course, remember, are the monkeys, apes, and humans. So haplorhines, that's our group. And Mymonoids are probably most likely, our most primitive true primate ancestors. And again, above Adepoids and Mymonoids, the apical ancestor would have been the Adepoids. And the first true primate leading towards the Adepoids with just a few characteristics, of course, is Purgatorius. That's the model which we have right now. Now, when did this sort of separation, the solidified groups begin to happen, Strepsirrhini and haplorhine? Well, shortly just after Adepoids and Mymonoids began to form. They began to form together as a group as true primates around 55 million years ago. And just by 54 million years, another million years goes by, Strepsirrhines and haplorhines begin to solidly form. Now, Adepoids and Mymonoids are still around. They split off to form these Strepsirrhine and haplorhine groups. And the Adepoids and Mymonoids are going to be around for a while until they finally go extinct because of the improvements of that split, the phylogenetic split, right? Creates improvements in Strepsirrhines and in haplorhines, the niches which they are in, which put the ancestral stocks Adepoids and Mymonoids out of business. That's a traditional sort of evolutionary pattern which we see. Right. So what would be a model then? If I could do a phylogenetic model, the one that which I prefer. Remember, I'm telling you what I prefer about my experience, as a researcher here. And there are many different think tanks on why it could be different, but I think this is the one that's holding the truth now, right? So we have this, this early origin where really what happens is that the first Adepoids, right, sort of do the bulwark. It becomes sort of a Mymonoids, and the Mymonoids quickly split off into a whole group called Adepoids. And now we have Mymonoids and Adepoids out there together. Adepoids make their own run. And of course, they're going to be a dead end, but before they're a dead end, they split off and create the Strepsirrhine group, which is populated with all the modern day lemurs, lorises, and bush babies. Okay? So, contrapunctually, as the Mymonoids make their first transition away from the Adepoids, go off to Adepoids, the group that becomes more solidly Adepoid will make a split. And Adepoids make their run, the true Adepoids, and they go out of business. But before they go out of business, they produce tarsiers. And the tarsiers are there in the world today. And where their base split was to produce Mymonoids, and that tarsiers go in direction. The other direction were anthropoids. The anthropoids were, of course, very successful. All the monkeys and apes and humans out there, and they exist today. So we're going to be looking and trying to fill in these gaps. Now, how did the Strepsirrhines come to rise? How do these groups like tarsiers and anthropoids? Now, When we look at tarsiers and anthropoids of the group, we also refer to those as haplolines, as the haploline groups, which we can actually, we'll be looking at that classification. But for right now, when we think about, monkeys and apes and humans, we refer to those as haplorines, and lemurs and loris is just structure lines. Okay, so in this particular slide, let's have a look at this. This puts it sort of all together in a model in which I sort of privilege. Right? Now, notice I haven't put in, this is one of these charts without dates. I think it kind of, complicates stuff when you sort of overline dates on stuff. We'll fill those in later when we look at the actual fossil record. What are the important ones that are making transition? For right now, let's just do it by epochs. Because what's interesting about primate evolution is you can almost track it perfectly epoch by epoch by epoch. Important things happen in each and every single one of them. Important things happen in the first epoch of the Cenozoic, the Paleocene. The next epoch, the Eocene. The following epoch, the Oligocene. And then the following epoch, the Miocene. Now, after the Miocene, we're going to get into the Pliocene and Pleistocene, which are important transitions for humans, right? But for early primate evolution, this is where the actions end. So in the Paleocene, what do we see? Irradiation of Plesiadapiforms, earlier precursed by probably Purgatorius down there. But the Paleocene's all about Plesiadapiforms. What's the Eocene all about? Well, the arrival of the first true primates, the Adepoids and the Mymonoids. There we can see them right there. And the Mymonoids are going to be splitting off into groups, which are the tarsiers, and they split off into the higher level ones, which are the anthropoids, populated by New World monkeys, Old World monkeys, apes, and finally humans. Conversely, the Adepoids, which arrived just around, 55 million years ago, within a million years, just like the Mymonoids, a million years later, they diversify off into the modern day groups, which contain the Lariciforms and Lemuriforms, as well as the bush babies. They should be in there too. But more of the traditional Adepoids are still around for a while. As you can see that they radiate off into different groups, and they will eventually go extinct because the improvements that we see by the split, the Lariciforms and Lemuriforms and bush babies, are just better at coping with their environment. And there's the ones which are successful. All right, let's move on. So when we consider, all this happening, why is it happening? Why primates, I think, is a very important consideration. Well, the first consideration to think about is climate and things which are changing within the environment. The most important change that happened was diet. That at the beginning of, but the middle of the Mesozoic, about 150 million years ago, we have the arrival of angiosperms. And that's just, those are plants which we call angiosperm, technically means just encased seed. But encased seed also means a certain type of plant with a certain type of reproductive system, where, the reproductive system is by flowers. They produce, pollen, and pollen has to travel great distances to pollinate the other plant for the stamen, for the female reproductive members. So the thing about the strategy about this means that flowers are produced to attract things that can do the job of pollination, for the plants. And the first things that do the pollination for the plants are insects. And the arrival of the insects means there should be, and there are, new forms of life that exploit that opening niche. Now, eventually, the flowers are going to be, opening up and morphing into fruits. When we think about what a fruit is, it's just the extension of the female part of the flower. It grows the fruit, which grows the seeds within them. And the arrival of the fruit means, new niches open up for new sorts of forms of life to exploit those. And of course, primates are them too. So we can look at the evolutionary sequence that's going to happen as plants begin to evolve, and primates begin to evolve too, to keep track, to keep march with the new niches which are opening up. But of course, all this has to be, sort of a precursor by changes in the climate too. The world needs to become ready for our flowering plants, and particular type of flowering plants, which we're going to see. Let's have a look at this chart, what it tells us. This one tells us about overall global temperature. This happened over the last 65 million years, in other words, the entire Cenozoic era. So you can see the Paleocene way back there at 65 million years ago, and now you can see time zero where we're at. So where are we on time zero? Well, see where the little zero line is in that sort of like little lavender colored box? Go over the zero line near where 3 is, and the green line that comes up, they tell you exactly where we're at in temperature right now. Now, about 13 to 14,000 years ago, we were down to where like -8 is. We're at the very bottom because we just came out of an ice age. But the last 13 million years ago, we've turned around, the Earth has warmed up. That's where we are right now. Now, it seems like we're getting global warming right now, which we are. But now compare this to the beginning of the Cenozoic. Let's go back 65 million years. Have a look at that. Oh my gosh, look how much warmer things were. Man, ocean, ocean levels were 150 feet to 200 feet higher than they are now. Sacramento Valley was a place you could go sail a boat around it. It was pretty awesome, I guess. But what's more important is it produced a real optimum sort of condition for flowering plants. No longer were flowering plants sort of compressed into low latitudes like they are now. Flowering plants were able to sort of radiate into upper latitudes, like where Greenland is. Even Canada was a subtropical, forest at that particular period of time. And warm weather produces a lot of different types of fruits, and particularly citrus fruits, which can produce ascorbic acid, vitamin C. In fact, most of the plants in many areas are producing vitamin C. And this is occurring as we get to about 53 million years ago. Notice we have what we call the Eocene optimum. See how warm it spikes up there? And that's when the optimum is optimum for the plants and for primates. Now, it doesn't mean optimum for polar bears, of course, but optimum for plants and primates. This is a very sort of primate-centered sort of chart in many ways, but it's very true. Maximum radiation of plants. Huge amounts of angiosperm plants, fruit trees growing everywhere, it's wonderful. And that means there's a huge primate radiation. Lots of populations of primates beginning to occur at that time, the true primates, right? The Mymonoids and the Adepoids. And because the numbers of them are so high, we get more mutations. We can think about this. What creates a lot of evolution in a population are mutations. And the more individuals you have, the more mutations you have, and the faster your adaptive radiation can occur. So we do get a pretty fast adaptive radiation of primates. So as soon as Placidiiforms make a transition to Mymoids and Adepoids, just a million years later, they become more solid groups, right? The Strepsirrhines and the haplorhines, and bam, diversification happens very quickly. In fact, by 35 million years ago, we have 35 different groups of primates. Here's interesting, as it compared today, we only have 5 groups of primates left today. What happened to them? The five groups we have are lemurs, lorises, bush babies, tarsiers, and the aggregate anthropoids. Those are the 5 big groups. Previous to 34 million years ago, up to 50 million years ago, we had like 35 different groups. So there's a mystery of where they went. We'll solve that in a second. But for the meantime, let's think about this. We got all these new trees out there. Many of them are producing, ascorbic acids. And we have to remember too that when the Mymoids began to make their transition into the haplorhines, but they're the fruit eaters, right? They're the real fruit eaters. And the types of fruit in which they're feeding on are ascorbic acid fruits because the temperatures are so warm, right? They're producing, vitamin C. Well, here's what happens is that we produce what we call vitamin C dependency at this particular period of time. Primates become dependent on vitamin C. It's amazing. Let's have a look at this. So here is the point at which we lose the ability to make vitamin C in the haplorhine group. So the anthropoids, all of us anthropoids have to eat vitamin C because our ancestors were eating so much fruit with vitamin C that the early ancestors had mutations in the pathways that could produce vitamin C in our body. And because we were getting fruits with vitamin C all the time. So after that, we all became dependent. That's why you have to eat lemons and oranges or take vitamin C supplements, right? So that includes all the prosimian tarsiers, which are in the haplorhine group, newer monkeys, older monkeys, humans, and apes. Whereas the other group, remember the Adepoids that gave rise to the Strepsirrhines? Remember, they were eating a lot of leaves, right? A lot of leaves, not a lot of fruits within their diet. You see, that meant that they kept having to produce their own vitamin C. So they never lost that ability to. Today, they don't have to take supplementary vitamin C's or eat fruits with ascorbic acid in because they can make it themselves, right? And the reason that that was a successful mutation, we have to think about it, is that biochemical processes take energy. And really, we don't think about it. We eat so much food all the time. This is the product of modern human society. Many animals are on a life and death energy budget. So anything they can save in the manufacturing of biologically expensive molecules, the better off they are. So when the pathways are broken to producing vitamin C, which they can get from their own diet, it saves them energy, right? And it gives them a competitive advantage. So by slow differential reproductive success, they edge out the previous populations, which had the healthy alleles, the ones that work to make the vitamin C. So the alleles that came in were the ones for broken vitamin C manufacturing, right? So we can think about that too. Sometimes defective alleles, right, that shut down processes are actually biologically productive. evolutionarily productive for the new species. So, we can see that today, in looking at other species where we lose the production of vitamin C. And by the way, gulonolactone oxidase is the actual protein, the enzyme that actually does the final step in the creation of ascorbic acid vitamin C. And it's a mutation in the gene. So the GULU gene has the mutation. So where do we see that happening? Elsewhere in nature, well, in primates. We see it in bats because a lot of bats are fruit. They mostly eat fruit. So bats have lost the ability to make vitamin C because they take it out of their diets. Guinea pigs too. Guinea pigs have a lineage where there's a ton of guinea pigs, and most of the guinea pig stocks eat fruits and which have high values of ascorbic acid in. Therefore, they've lost the ability. And look at the monkeys down here. And that's, of course, the stuff in the gray. Remember, we're looking at stuff in just in the light gray. All the stuff you're seeing down there are haplorhines, owl monkeys, marmosets, gibbons, of course, they're the apes, gibbons, orangutans, grills, and humans. We're all haplorhines. We're all descended from those creatures that began to lose vitamin C production 45 million years ago, right during that big spread of ascorbic acid producing plants, right, in the Eocene during the Eocene optimum. All right. So we're going to talk more about in the next part too, are the rise more specifically of the anthropoids, our group. When did they begin? What were they like? What were the transitions that gave the rise to the monkey groups and finally the ape groups? And then we'll get into talking about how apes made their transition to the hominoids, our group, and why. So I'm going to stop the share today, and I'll see you guys in the next lecture.